In the autumn of 1885, a new governess arrived at Blackwood Manor in Lexington, Massachusetts, carrying nothing but a worn leather suitcase and a letter of recommendation. Within 3 weeks, Bridget O'Sullivan would discover why the second-floor room at the end of the East Wing had remained locked for 15 years, and why the late Cornelius Blackwood had threatened to dismiss any servant who so much as touched its brass doorknob. What she found behind that door would not only destroy one of New England's most respected families, but also call into question the authenticity of revolutionary documents housed in some of America's most prestigious museums. Before we continue with Bridget's disturbing discovery at Blackwood Manor, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our darkest historical mysteries. Tell us in the comments what city and country you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers from around the world who share our fascination with the shadows of the past. Your support helps us bring you these carefully researched stories every week. But let's return to that fateful autumn when a young Irish woman would uncover secrets that had been carefully buried for over a decade. According to the fragmentary records that survived the family's later attempts to destroy all evidence, and the whispered accounts that still circulate among the older residents of Lexington, the mystery of Blackwood Manor began long before Bridget O'Sullivan ever set foot on its grounds. Lexington in 1885 was a town caught between its revolutionary past and its industrial future. The old colonial homes still stood along Massachusetts Avenue, their weathered clapboard siding bearing witness to the shot heard round the world just over a century before. But now the Boston and Maine Railroad brought visitors from the city to see the battlefields, and with them came a growing appetite for authentic relics of America's founding era. Blackwood Manor sat on a hill overlooking the historic town centre, its imposing Victorian Gothic architecture a stark contrast to the modest colonial homes below. Built in 1847 by shipping magnate Thaddeus Blackwood, the mansion had passed to his son Cornelius in 1863. Unlike his merchant father, Cornelius had devoted his life to scholarly pursuits, becoming one of New England's most respected historians and collectors of Revolutionary War artifacts. The townspeople of Lexington held the Blackwood family in high regard. Cornelius frequently donated items to the local historical society and had written several well-received papers on the events of April 19, 1775. His collection of original documents, displayed in locked cases throughout the manor's library, included correspondence attributed to Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and even a letter reportedly written by George Washington himself during his stay in Cambridge. After Cornelius's sudden death from pneumonia in September 1885, his widow Eleanor found herself unable to manage the vast estate alone. Their only son, Thomas, was completing his studies at Harvard and would not return home for months. It was then that Eleanor placed an advertisement in the Boston Herald for a governess and household manager, specifying that the position required someone comfortable with the maintenance of historical documents and artifacts. Bridget O'Sullivan answered that call. At 26, she had spent 3 years as a governess for a prominent family in Boston, and before that she had worked briefly at the Boston Public Library's manuscript collection. Her references praised her careful attention to detail and her respectful handling of delicate historical materials. What they didn't mention was her insatiable curiosity, a trait that would soon prove both blessing and curse. From her first day at Blackwood Manor, Bridget noticed the locked room. It stood at the end of the East Wing's second-floor corridor, its heavy oak door distinguished by an ornate brass lock that seemed newer than the other hardware in the house. When she inquired about it during her orientation, Eleanor Blackwood's response was swift and definitive. "That room is never to be opened," Eleanor had said, her usually gentle voice taking on an edge that made Bridget step back. My late husband's instructions were explicit. No one, not the servants, not myself, not even our son, is permitted to enter that chamber. The key was hidden away years ago, and it shall remain so. But Bridget had keen eyes, and she had noticed something Eleanor perhaps had not intended to reveal. When the widow spoke of the hidden key, her gaze had flickered momentarily toward the library below, specifically toward the large mahogany desk that had been Cornelius's workspace. On October 15th, 1885, exactly 3 weeks after Bridget's arrival, a violent autumn storm struck eastern Massachusetts. The wind howled through the manor's corridors, rattling windows, and causing the old house to creak and groan like a ship at sea. Eleanor had retired early with a severe headache, leaving Bridget alone to secure the windows and check that all the fires were properly banked. It was past midnight when Bridget made her way through the library, ensuring that no embers had escaped from the great fireplace. As she moved past Cornelius's desk, a particularly fierce gust of wind shook the house, and she heard something rattle inside one of the desk's drawers. The sound was distinct, metallic, rhythmic, like keys dancing against wood. Her heart racing, Bridget glanced toward the staircase. The house was silent except for the storm. Eleanor's bedroom was on the opposite side of the manor, and the other servants had long since retired to their quarters in the basement. With trembling fingers, she tried the desk drawer, finding it unlocked. Inside, beneath a stack of correspondence, her fingers found what she sought. A brass key, its head ornately carved, with the same pattern as the lock on the forbidden door. But there was something else, a smaller, simpler key attached to the same ring. And beneath the letters, she discovered a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Cornelius's precise handwriting. The first entry was dated March 12th, 1870. The Wellington Commission proceeds successfully. The aged paper responds well to the tea bath, and the iron gall ink, when properly diluted, produces the exact fade patterns one would expect from a document of 1775. Peterson in Boston has agreed to authenticate the piece for a fee, though he does not question my attribution methods. Bridget's hands shook as she read further. Entry after entry detailed what could only be described as an elaborate scheme of historical forgery. Cornelius Blackwood, the respected historian, had been creating fake Revolutionary War documents and selling them to collectors throughout New England and beyond. The journal revealed the scope of his operation. Letters supposedly written by George Washington, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock. Military orders from the Continental Army. Even personal correspondence between colonial families. Each entry meticulously documented the creation process, from the careful aging of paper with tea and tobacco smoke to the precise replication of 18th century handwriting styles. But what chilled Bridget most was the final entry, dated September 3rd, 1885, just days before Cornelius's death. The workshop must be sealed permanently. Too many questions from the Harvard curator about the Washington letters. Thomas must never know the truth of his inheritance. The shame would destroy our family name. E suspects nothing, praise God. The key shall be hidden where only I can find it, should circumstances require the destruction of evidence. Thunder crashed overhead as Bridget realized what the locked room contained. Cornelius Blackwood's forgery workshop, filled with evidence of 15 years of deception that had corrupted collections from Boston to Philadelphia. The larger key fit the lock on the forbidden door perfectly. The door opened with barely a whisper, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Beyond lay a chamber that took Bridget's breath away, not for its beauty, but for the systematic precision of the deception it contained. The room had been converted into a complete forgery operation. Tables lined the walls, each dedicated to a specific aspect of the process. On the first table, sheets of paper lay soaking in shallow trays of tea and coffee, slowly taking on the amber hue of age. Another table held bottles of various inks, their labels written in Cornelius's careful script: iron gall, Washington formula, lamp black, Adams variant, sepia reproduction, Hancock style. Along the far wall stood a bookshelf filled with reference materials, authentic 18th century documents under glass, presumably used as templates for the forgeries. Bridget recognized several items that were supposedly unique pieces in public collections. If these were the originals, what had the museums been displaying? But it was the desk in the center of the room that truly revealed the scope of Cornelius's crimes. Its surface was covered with work in various stages of completion. A letter bearing George Washington's forged signature lay beside a magnifying glass. Next to it, a military order from the Continental Congress waited for its final aging treatment. A leather ledger lay open, its pages filled with client names, prices, and delivery dates. Bridget's eyes widened as she read the entries. $500, Bradford Collection, Boston, Washington Letter Ore, Valley Forge. $750, Morrison Estate, Hartford, Adams Correspondence, complete set. 1200, Harvard University, Military Orders, Lexington Engagement. Harvard University. Thomas Blackwood's own institution had purchased forgeries from his father. As Bridget turned the pages, she found records stretching back to 1870. The amounts were staggering. Over the course of 15 years, Cornelius had earned what would amount to a fortune through his deceptions. But more troubling were the institutions listed as buyers: the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Library of Congress, private collectors throughout New England, and even the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. The small key from the ring opened a cabinet beneath the desk. Inside, Bridget found correspondence with authenticators, curators, and dealers, men who had either been fooled by Cornelius's work or, in some cases, seemed complicit in the deception. One letter from a prominent Boston authenticator read, "Your latest Washington piece is exceptional. The aging techniques you've employed are beyond anything I've seen. I trust our usual arrangement regarding provenance documentation remains in effect." Our usual arrangement. The phrase sent chills down Bridget's spine. How many others had known the truth? But perhaps most damning of all was a letter from Thomas Blackwood himself, dated just 2 months before his father's death. The young man had written from Harvard, expressing excitement about his thesis project on Revolutionary War correspondence, and mentioning how proud he was to be using his father's collection as primary sources. As dawn broke over Lexington, Bridget sat surrounded by the evidence of a deception that had polluted American historical records for 15 years. She now understood why Cornelius had sealed this room, and why he had hidden the key. The revelation of his crimes would not only destroy the Blackwood family reputation, but would call into question the authenticity of hundreds of documents in major collections across the country. For 3 days, Bridget wrestled with her discovery. She continued her duties at the manor, caring for Eleanor Blackwood and maintaining the household, but the knowledge of what lay behind the locked door consumed her thoughts. Every time she passed the library and saw the cases of Cornelius's collection, she wondered how many of those documents were authentic and how many were products of the hidden workshop. Her dilemma deepened when a letter arrived from Thomas Blackwood. The young man wrote enthusiastically about his upcoming return from Harvard, mentioning his excitement to finally inherit his father's scholarly legacy. He planned to donate several key pieces from the collection to Harvard's library as part of his graduation thesis, pieces that Bridget now suspected were elaborate fakes. The moral weight of her knowledge grew heavier when Dr. Harrison Webb, curator of the Massachusetts Historical Society, arrived at the manor on October 20th. Eleanor had invited him to assess the collection for potential acquisitions, continuing her late husband's tradition of supporting historical preservation. "Mrs. Blackwood, Dr." Webb said as Bridget served tea in the library, "Your husband's authentication methods were truly remarkable. The Washington correspondence we acquired last year has been the crown jewel of our Revolutionary War collection. Scholars from as far as England have come to study it." Bridget's hands trembled as she poured the tea. She watched Dr. Webb examined the display cases with obvious admiration, praising the quality and provenance of documents that she now knew were carefully crafted fakes. "There's been some discussion in Boston academic circles," Dr. Webb continued, "about establishing a formal authentication center based on Cornelius's techniques. His ability to verify the age and authenticity of documents was unparalleled. The irony was almost unbearable. Cornelius Blackwood's skill at creating convincing forgeries had made him renowned as an expert in detecting authenticity." That evening, after Dr. Webb had departed with promises to return for a more thorough evaluation, Bridget made a decision that would change everything. She could not allow the deception to continue, but she also could not simply expose the truth without understanding its full scope. She needed to know exactly which documents in public collections were forgeries and which might be authentic. Returning to the workshop, she began a systematic examination of Cornelius's records. The ledger revealed a pattern that made her stomach turn. Many of the most celebrated Revolutionary War documents in major collections had passed through Cornelius's hands at some point in the past 15 years. Some he had sold directly as newly discovered pieces. Others he had authenticated for other dealers, presumably marking genuine articles as fakes while promoting his own creations as authentic. In a hidden compartment at the back of the cabinet, Bridget found something even more disturbing: photographs. Cornelius had documented his work, creating before and after images of his forgeries. But more than that, he had photographs of himself working alongside other men in what appeared to be similar workshops. The operation had not been limited to Blackwood Manor. One photograph, dated 1878, showed Cornelius shaking hands with a man identified in the margin as J. Peterson, Boston. Another showed him examining documents with someone labeled Dr. Mitchell, Philadelphia Authentication Guild. The network of complicit individuals appeared to extend far beyond one man's private obsession. But it was the final photograph that made Bridget's blood run cold. Taken in 1884, just 1 year before Cornelius's death, it showed him standing in his workshop with a younger man whose face she recognized from family portraits throughout the manor. Thomas Blackwood, home from Harvard for the summer, stood beside his father, examining what appeared to be a freshly completed forgery. The son had known. Despite the journal entries suggesting otherwise, Thomas Blackwood had been aware of his father's crimes. On October 25th, a telegram arrived that sent Eleanor Blackwood into a state of barely controlled panic. Thomas was returning home immediately, his studies interrupted by what he described as urgent matters regarding father's collection. He would arrive on the afternoon train, accompanied by 2 representatives from Harvard University, who were eager to finalize the acquisition of several key pieces for the university's collection. Bridget watched Eleanor's face grow pale as she read the telegram aloud. For the first time since her arrival, she saw genuine fear in the widow's eyes. "Bridget," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to ensure that the house is in perfect order. Thomas has very specific ideas about his father's legacy. Everything must be precisely as Cornelius left it." But Bridget had already noticed that things were not as Cornelius had left them. In her repeated visits to the workshop, she had observed that several items were missing from the shelves. Someone else had been in that room since Cornelius's death, removing evidence piece by piece. That suspicion was confirmed when she discovered Eleanor Blackwood in the workshop at 2 o'clock in the morning, carefully packing documents into a leather satchel. The widow froze when she saw Bridget in the doorway, her face a mask of terror and guilt. "You weren't supposed to find this place," Eleanor whispered, clutching the satchel to her chest. "Cornelius swore he had hidden the key where no one would think to look." "Mrs. Blackwood," Bridget said carefully, "I know what your husband was doing. I've read his journal. I've seen the records." Eleanor's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Do you think I'm a fool, girl? Do you think I lived in this house for 20 years without knowing what my husband did in his private hours? I knew exactly what Cornelius was doing, and I said nothing because I was a coward." The confession hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Eleanor sank into the chair at Cornelius's desk, suddenly looking far older than her 53 years. "It started small," she continued, her voice barely audible. "A single letter, supposedly found in an old Bible purchased at an estate sale. Cornelius sold it to a collector in Boston for $50, and the man was so pleased that he asked if we had anything else. That was 1870. By 1875, Cornelius was earning more from his discoveries than he ever had from his legitimate scholarship. But the scale of it," Bridget said, gesturing toward the workshop around them. "He corrupted collections across the country and made us wealthy beyond anything we could have imagined through honest means," Eleanor replied. "This house, Thomas's education at Harvard, my wardrobe, our social standing, all of it built on lies and forgeries. When Cornelius died, I thought it was over. I thought I could simply lock this room forever and let the secret die with him." "But Thomas knows," Bridget said. "I found a photograph. Thomas knows nothing." Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. "My son believes he is inheriting the legacy of a great scholar and collector. He has no idea that half the documents in our collection are fakes created by his own father, and he must never know." The sound of a carriage on the gravel drive below sent both women into motion. Through the workshop's small window, they could see the lights of Thomas's hired coach approaching the manor. "Help me," Eleanor pleaded, clutching Bridget's arm. "Help me destroy the evidence before Thomas arrives. If he learns the truth, it will destroy him. He's planning to build his entire career on his father's reputation." Just when they thought they had more time to decide what to do, the horror of Blackwood Manor intensifies. If this story is sending chills down your spine, hit that like button to support our channel, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you won't miss more dark mysteries like this one. Share this video with a friend who loves historical secrets. We're building a community of people fascinated by the shadows hidden in the past. Let's discover together what happens when Thomas Blackwood returns home to claim his inheritance. Thomas Blackwood entered his family home at 3:30 that morning, accompanied by Dr. Edmund Hartwell and Professor James Morrison from Harvard University. Even in the dim gaslight of the foyer, Bridget could see that the young man bore a striking resemblance to his father. The same piercing grey eyes, the same careful, measured movements of someone accustomed to handling delicate objects. But there was something else in Thomas's manner that immediately set Bridget on edge. He moved through the house with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where everything was located, despite having been away at school for months. His greetings to his mother were perfunctory, and his eyes kept drifting toward the staircase that led to the second floor. "Mother," he said, barely glancing at Eleanor, "I trust Father's workshop remains secure. The gentlemen from Harvard are particularly eager to examine his authentication equipment. His techniques for age verification were apparently quite revolutionary." Eleanor's face went white. "Thomas, dear, I'm not sure what you mean. Your father's study is downstairs in the library." "Please, Mother." Thomas's voice carried a note of impatience that chilled the room. "Dr. Hartwell and Professor Morrison have traveled a considerable distance. There's no need to maintain Father's little charade about the locked room anymore." The casual way he dismissed what his mother believed to be a devastating secret told Bridget everything she needed to know. Thomas had not merely known about his father's forgery operation, he had been an active participant. Dr. Hartwell, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, stepped forward. "Mrs. Blackwood, we understand this may be difficult, but Thomas has been most helpful in explaining his father's unique methodologies. Harvard University is prepared to offer a substantial sum for both the authentication techniques and the specialized equipment Cornelius developed." "You see, Mother," Thomas said, producing a familiar brass key from his vest pocket, Father gave me my own key years ago. He wanted me to understand the family business before I inherited it. As the group moved toward the staircase, Bridget felt the walls of deception closing in around her. She followed at a distance, her mind racing to understand the full scope of what was happening. The workshop, when Thomas unlocked it, was not as Bridget had left it. In the hours since Eleanor's midnight visit, someone had been busy. The tables were now arranged as if for a demonstration, with various stages of the document aging process clearly displayed. What had been a secret chamber of criminal activity had been transformed into what appeared to be a legitimate research laboratory. "Remarkable," Professor Morrison breathed, examining the bottles of carefully labeled inks. "The precision of Cornelius's methodology is extraordinary. Look at these aging techniques. Tea baths, controlled exposure to tobacco smoke, even what appears to be a method for replicating the specific fade patterns of iron gall ink over time." Thomas moved through the room like a tour guide, explaining his father's techniques with obvious pride and detailed knowledge. The key insight Father developed was that authentication requires understanding every aspect of how documents naturally age. By replicating those processes in controlled conditions, he could verify the authenticity of questionable pieces with unprecedented accuracy. But Bridget heard what the Harvard professors did not: the subtle double meanings in Thomas's explanations. Every technique he described as an authentication method was actually a forgery technique, described in terms that made the criminal enterprise sound like legitimate scholarly research. "This process here," Thomas continued, indicating the tea-staining tables, allowed Father to demonstrate conclusively when documents had been artificially aged by unscrupulous dealers. By showing clients exactly how such forgeries were created, he could guarantee the authenticity of his own attributions. Dr. Hartwell was taking copious notes. "And Harvard University would acquire not only the equipment, but also Cornelius's written methodologies." "Certainly," Thomas replied smoothly. Father documented every technique in exhaustive detail. His journal of authentication procedures is quite comprehensive. Bridget realized with growing horror that Thomas was selling his father's forgery operation to Harvard University as a legitimate authentication laboratory. The criminal enterprise would continue, hidden behind the respectability of one of America's most prestigious institutions. But then Eleanor Blackwood spoke, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Thomas," she said quietly, "show them the photographs." The young man froze, his confident demeanor cracking for the first time since his arrival. "Mother, I don't think—" "Show them the photographs of you and your father working together in this room. Show them the ones where you're examining the Washington letters before they were sold to the Massachusetts Historical Society. Show them the image of you signing John Hancock's name on Continental Congress documents." The silence in the room was deafening. Dr. Hartwell and Professor Morrison exchanged uncertain glances, suddenly aware that they might have stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple equipment acquisition. Thomas's mask finally slipped completely. "You stupid woman," he hissed at his mother. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Do you understand how much money Harvard was prepared to pay for Father's techniques?" "I understand," Eleanor replied, her voice steady for the first time since Bridget had known her, "that I've spent 15 years watching my husband corrupt American history, and I will not spend another 15 years watching my son do the same thing." The confrontation that followed would later be recorded in the files of the Massachusetts Attorney General's office as one of the most significant cases of historical fraud in American history. Thomas Blackwood's attempt to sell his father's forgery operation to Harvard University collapsed within hours of his mother's revelation. Dr. Hartwell and Professor Morrison, faced with clear evidence of an extensive criminal conspiracy, had no choice but to report their findings to university authorities. By dawn, representatives from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Boston Public Library, and eventually the federal government were en route to Blackwood Manor. The full scope of Cornelius Blackwood's operation would take investigators months to unravel. The final report, filed in the spring of 1886, identified over 300 documents in major collections that required re-authentication. Of these, nearly half proved to be sophisticated forgeries created in the workshop at Blackwood Manor. Thomas Blackwood was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and expelled from Harvard University. During his trial, prosecutors revealed that he had been actively involved in his father's operation since 1883, helping to create and distribute forgeries while using his position as a Harvard student to provide academic credibility to the enterprise. Eleanor Blackwood, granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation with investigators, provided detailed testimony about the extent of her husband's crimes. Her decision to expose her son had not been made lightly. She later told investigators that she had spent sleepless nights weighing the destruction of her family against the corruption of American historical records. The investigation revealed that Cornelius Blackwood had not operated alone. The network of complicit authenticators, dealers, and collectors extended throughout New England and beyond. Several prominent figures in the antiquarian document trade were implicated, and at least 3 other forgery workshops were discovered and shut down. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that some genuinely authentic historical documents had disappeared from major collections, apparently replaced with Blackwood forgeries, while the originals were sold on the black market to private collectors who would never allow them to be examined by scholars. Bridget O'Sullivan found herself at the center of the investigation, her discovery of the workshop key having set in motion the unraveling of 15 years of deception. She provided crucial testimony about the contents of Cornelius's journal and the evidence she had found in the locked room. The Blackwood family fortune, built largely on the proceeds of the forgery operation, was seized by the government to help fund the massive re-authentication process required to restore integrity to affected collections. Blackwood Manor itself was sold at auction, eventually becoming the headquarters for a legitimate historical preservation society. As the investigation concluded, Bridget reflected on the terrible irony of what she had discovered. Cornelius Blackwood had been celebrated as one of New England's most skilled experts in detecting forged historical documents, when in reality his expertise came from his intimate knowledge of how such forgeries were created. His reputation for authentication had provided the perfect cover for his crimes, allowing him to condemn genuine articles as fakes while promoting his own creations as authentic treasures. The locked room that no one was permitted to enter had contained not just evidence of criminal activity, but proof of a systematic corruption of American historical memory. In their greed for authentic connection to the nation's founding, collectors and institutions had been eager to believe in the authenticity of documents that confirmed their romantic vision of the past. This mystery reminds us that the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, has a way of demanding to be revealed. The very expertise that Cornelius Blackwood used to deceive others ultimately provided the evidence needed to expose his crimes. What do you think about this story of deception hidden behind respectability? Do you believe there might be other such operations still undiscovered in our historical institutions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dark tale from America's past, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and tell a friend who loves historical mysteries. There are more shadows from the past waiting to be explored, and we'll uncover them together in our next video.